There are some silences that are earned, paid for with noise and grief until the world owes you a debt of quiet. And then there are the other kinds, the ones that are inflicted. The vast, hollow quiet of a place where a soul has been scooped out, leaving only the shell. Have you ever truly felt that kind of emptiness? Not just loneliness, but a silence so profound it has weight, pressing down on your shoulders like a shroud. A man can get used to that weight. He can mistake it for peace. Abner had worn that silence for 6 years, ever since the fever took Mary and left him with nothing but the creak of floorboards and the sigh of the plains. His ranch was a kingdom of dust and memory, bordered by fences he repaired not to keep his few cattle in, but to give his hands something to do, a reason to meet the sun each morning. His world was small, contained, and blessedly quiet. The days bled one into the next, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun across the porch steps. He'd rise, boil coffee, check the herd, mend what was broken, and then sit in the growing dark, watching the horizon swallow the light. It wasn't a life, not really. It was an echo of one. A long, slow exhale after the final word has been spoken. He asked for nothing more. He expected nothing more. The quiet was his penance and his comfort, a familiar ghost sitting in the chair opposite his own. He thought he knew all its shapes and textures. He was wrong. The silence he knew was about absence. He was about to learn about the silence that comes after a scream you never heard. He found her at the far edge of his property, a place he only checked once a season. It wasn't his fence, but a remnant from the previous owner who'd had grander plans that turned to dust just like everything else out here. A single forgotten post jutting from the baked earth. At first he saw only the blanket, a drab gray heap against the bleached wood. Probably just discarded trash from some traveler taking a shortcut. But something was wrong. The shape was too deliberate, too still. He reined in his horse, the leather creaking in the oppressive heat. Dust motes danced in the slab of sunlight cutting across the plains. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. Each step felt loud, an intrusion. As he got closer, he saw the rope. Thick, frayed, wrapped tight around the post and disappearing under the blanket. A cold knot formed in his gut. This wasn't discarded trash. This was deliberate. This was cruel. He reached down, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gripping the coarse wool. He lifted the blanket, and his blood ran cold. It was a girl, barely a woman. Her face, smudged with dirt and tears, was Chinese, with high cheekbones and a jaw set with a stubbornness that even exhaustion couldn't erase. She was wearing a tattered white prairie dress, the fabric thin and ripped at the shoulder. Her feet were bare, caked in mud and scratched raw. Her wrists were bound to the post, the rope having rubbed her skin into a bloody mess. For a moment he thought she was dead. Then her eyes flickered open. They were deep, dark pools of nothing. Not fear, not anger, just a profound, terrifying emptiness. Her lips, cracked and pale, parted. A dry, rasping sound escaped. "Just kill me fast." The words were a surrender, a plea for an ending from a person who'd already seen it. Abner, a man who hadn't felt a jolt of true emotion in 6 years, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The silence of his world had just been shattered, not by a sound, but by a whisper. He didn't answer her. Words were useless things in a moment like this. He pulled the knife from his belt, its worn leather sheath a familiar weight against his hip. The girl, Lynn, though he did not know her name, flinched, her eyes finally showing a spark of something. Fear. She squeezed them shut, her body tensing for the blow. He ignored it. He knelt, the sun beating down on his back, and sawed at the thick ropes binding her wrists. The hemp was stiff and unforgiving. His movements were steady, practiced, the same way he'd cut a calf from a tangle of wire. When the last strand gave way, her arms fell limp at her sides. He didn't try to speak to her, didn't try to offer comfort. He simply stood, sheathed his knife, and turned his back for a moment to fetch the canteen from his horse. The world felt unnaturally sharp, the buzz of a lone fly against the fence post like a drumbeat. He returned and knelt again, holding the canteen to her lips. She drank, at first in desperate, choking gulps, then more slowly. Water dribbled down her chin, tracing a clean path through the grime. When she was done, she slumped against the post, her head lolling. He knew he couldn't leave her. He also knew bringing her back to his cabin was a complication he hadn't faced in years. But it wasn't a choice. It was a fact. Gently, carefully, he worked his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other supporting her back. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her as if she were made of glass and carried her to his horse. He mounted, settling her in front of him, her head resting against his chest. The ride back was silent. He could feel the slight, ragged rhythm of her breathing, the unnatural heat of her skin through her thin dress. The world he was returning to was the same one he'd left that morning, but it was irrevocably changed. A life had been placed in his hands, and its fragility made his own solitary existence feel coarse and loud and shamefully easy. He had sought nothing, and now something had found him. He laid her on the simple cot in the corner of his one-room cabin, the one Mary had insisted they keep for any passing stranger in need. It hadn't been used in 6 years. The air in the cabin, usually still and smelling of dry wood and old coffee, now held a different scent. Dust, sweat, and a faint metallic tang of blood. Her pain had followed her indoors. He moved with a quiet efficiency, stoking the embers in the stove, putting a kettle on to boil. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack and soaked it in the warm water. He returned to the cot and began to clean the raw, chafed wounds on her wrists. She didn't stir, lost in a deep, exhausted sleep. Her face, now that some of the dirt was wiped away, was younger than he'd first thought. She was a girl, thrust into a horror that had aged her eyes 100 years. He worked without a wasted motion, applying a thin layer of salve he kept for rope burns on his livestock. The gesture felt both intimate and profoundly foreign. His hands, accustomed to the rough textures of leather, wood, and metal, felt clumsy and oversized, tending to such delicate damage. He left a cup of water and a piece of hard bread on the small crate beside the cot and retreated to his own side of the room. He sat in his chair, the familiar worn wood a poor comfort. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was a listening silence. It was filled with the sound of another person's breathing. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest under the thin dress. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone, and the feeling was not comfort. It was terror. It was the terrifying weight of responsibility, a burden he thought he had laid down for good. The sun set, and he didn't light a lamp, content to let the shadows lengthen and fill the room, hiding them both. Days unfolded in a new, unspoken rhythm. He would wake before dawn, move silently to avoid disturbing her, and do his morning chores. When he returned, he would find the food he'd left for her was gone, the cup empty. But she was always back on the cot, turned toward the wall, a silent, still figure. He never saw her eat, never saw her move. It was as if a ghost had taken up residence in his home. He didn't push, he didn't ask questions. He simply continued the routine, leaving water, bread, sometimes a little broth. He spoke only to his horse, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry. Then, on the fourth day, he came in from the heat to find her sitting on the edge of the cot, stitching a tear in her white dress with a needle and thread he'd left on a shelf. Her fingers were nimble, her movements precise. It was a small thing, mending a worthless piece of cloth, but it was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that she was not just a victim, not just a body to be tended to. She was a person, reclaiming a piece of herself. He stopped in the doorway, and for the first time their eyes met and held for more than a second. There was still a deep well of pain in her gaze, but beneath it there was something else, a flicker of iron. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and went about his business, but the air had changed. That evening he went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it, the scent of dried lavender and cedar filling the air. He reached in and pulled out a simple cotton shirt, Mary's. It was clean and soft. He folded it neatly and placed it at the foot of Lynn's cot without a word. The next morning she was wearing it. It was too big for her, hanging loosely on her small frame, but it was clean. It was a start. A week later their supply of flour was running low. Abner knew he had to make the half-day ride into the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town. Leaving her alone felt wrong, a risk he couldn't quite name, but staying wasn't an option. He told her where he was going with a simple gesture towards the empty flour sack. "Town. Be back by dark." She just nodded, her eyes following him as he saddled his horse. The town was a miserable collection of false-fronted buildings simmering under the relentless sun. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he heard them. Two men leaning against the saloon wall, their voices loud and coarse. They were dusty from the trail, with a shared look of casual cruelty about them. He recognized the type. Men who saw the world as something to be taken. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Should have just put the whole shipment in the river. More trouble than it's worth." The other man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Nah, the boss wanted that one. Said she was special. Just got to go back and collect our property." Abner's hand, reaching for the store's door, froze. Property. The word landed like a stone in his gut. He didn't need to hear any more. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the heat, that they were talking about her. He bought his flour, his jaw tight, his movements stiff. He saw Sheriff Brody leaning back in a chair outside his office, whittling a piece of wood. For a moment, Abner considered it. He walked over. "Sheriff?" Brody looked up, squinting. "Abner, what brings you to our humble metropolis?" Abner kept it brief. "Heard some talk, two men, about some property they lost out my way." The sheriff stopped whittling. He looked at Abner, then over at the men by the saloon, then back. He sighed, a tired, defeated sound. "Talk is cheap, Abner. A man's got a right to talk about his property, lost or otherwise. Got no reason to bother them." Abner stared at him, at the badge that was nothing more than a piece of tin, at the man who had chosen peace over justice. He knew then, with absolute clarity, that he was on his own. The law wouldn't help. The law was just another man who wanted a quiet life. The ride back to the ranch was long. The sack of flour behind him felt like a sack of stones. Every hoofbeat on the dry earth sounded like a ticking clock. What was he supposed to do? He was a rancher, not a lawman, not a fighter. His life was built around mending things, not breaking them. He could take her, ride east, leave her in a bigger town, someplace with a real sheriff, a place where she could disappear. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He could have his silence back. He could return to the quiet, empty life that he understood. When he saw the thin curl of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney, His heart seized for a second, thinking they had gotten there first. But as he drew closer, he saw her. She was outside, by the small, withered patch of earth where Mary had once grown herbs. She had a bucket of water and was carefully, patiently, tending to the scorched plants. She was coaxing life from the dead soil. He dismounted and watched her for a long moment, crossed her face before it was replaced by a look of relief by her usual guarded stillness. In that instant, his decision was made. It wasn't a thought, it was a feeling, a certainty that settled deep in his bones. This small patch of land, this quiet cabin, was his, and she was now a part of it. To turn her out would be the same as setting fire to his own home. It would be a betrayal of something he didn't even know he had left to betray. He had drawn a line around his lonely life years ago. Now he was drawing a new one, and she was inside it. He unsaddled his horse, his movements deliberate. That night he didn't just clean his rifle. He sat on the porch and methodically checked its action, oiled the mechanism, and laid out the cartridges in a neat row. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing to hold a line. They came 3 days later, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and red. 2 riders, stark silhouettes against the dying light. They didn't approach with caution. They rode straight for the cabin, arrogance in the straightness of their backs, in the way their horses trampled the very herbs Lynn had been tending. Abner was waiting. He sat on his porch chair, the rifle resting across his lap, its metal cool against his worn trousers. He had told Lynn to stay inside, to hide in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, no matter what she heard. She had looked at him, her dark eyes wide, and had simply nodded. The men reined in their horses a few yards from the porch. They were the same 2 from town. The one who had spat tobacco juice smirked, revealing stained teeth. "Evening, old man. We're looking for something. Came off a ship in the east. Small thing, but valuable. We tracked it right here to your doorstep." Abner didn't move. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You're mistaken. There's nothing here for you." The second man laughed. "Is that so? We heard different. We'll just take a look inside. Won't take but a minute." He made to dismount. "I said," Abner's voice was lower now, each word as solid as a stone, "there's nothing here for you." The first man's smirk vanished. His hand drifted down toward the pistol at his hip. "She's our property. We got a bill of sale. Now you can give her to us nice and easy, or we can burn this shack to the ground with you in it." Abner slowly stood up, the rifle held loosely in his hands, its barrel pointing toward the ground. He looked from one man to the other. He saw their greed, their cruelty, the casual way they valued a human life as less than a horse. He thought of her, huddled in the dark beneath the floor, of the rope burns on her wrists, of the deadness in her eyes when he'd first found her. The confrontation wasn't about glory or honor. It was about pest control. It was swift. It was final. The setting sun caught the glint of steel as the first man drew his weapon, but he was too slow. The crack of Abner's rifle was the only sound that broke the evening's stillness, and then another. It was over in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The silence that fell afterward was heavier than any that had come before. It was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sudden, shocking finality of death. The 2 bodies lay in the dust, small and insignificant against the vast, indifferent landscape. The horses, spooked, had already bolted, disappearing over the nearest rise. Abner stood on the porch, the rifle still warm in his hands, his knuckles white. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a killer. He felt only a profound, weary emptiness. This was the cost of breaking his isolation. This was the noise required to earn a new kind of quiet. The cabin door creaked open. Lynn emerged from the shadows. She didn't look at the bodies at first. She looked at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he couldn't name. He expected to see fear, or perhaps revulsion. Instead, he saw a deep, unsettling calm, an understanding. Her gaze then drifted to the scene in the yard. She took it in without a flicker of emotion, as if she were looking at fallen trees after a storm. She walked down the porch steps, her bare feet silent in the dirt. She stopped beside him and looked toward the horizon, where the last sliver of sun was vanishing. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Once, he took it. They worked together as once. He took it. They worked together as darkness fell, digging in the hard, dry earth a good distance from the cabin. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of shovels against dirt and their own quiet breathing. It was a grim, shared task, a burial of her past and his solitude. When they were finished, they stood for a moment over the disturbed earth. It was as if they had buried more than just two bodies. They had buried the ghosts that had haunted them both. In the week that followed, the silence on the ranch transformed again. It was no longer the hollow silence of loneliness, nor the heavy silence of violence. It was a shared quiet, a comfortable space that existed between two people who understood each other without the need for words. They fell into a new routine. He would do his work on the ranch, and she would tend to the cabin and the small garden, which was now showing faint signs of green. She cooked, simple meals of bread and beans, but the act of sharing food at the small table filled the cabin with a warmth it hadn't known in years. One evening, they were sitting on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. The air was cool and clean. She had been quiet for a long time, braiding a tough blade of prairie grass between her fingers. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "Lynn?" He turned to look at her. She wasn't looking at him, but at the small, intricate braid in her hands. He understood. It was an offering, a name, a beginning. He nodded, his throat tight. Abner. It was the first time they had named themselves to each other. A simple exchange, but it felt like a treaty being signed, a foundation being laid. He looked out at the vast darkness, at the pinpricks of light from stars that had been dead for 1,000 years. For the first time since Mary was gone, he didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. He felt solid. He felt present. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was full of the unspoken promise of another sunrise, of a shared cup of coffee, of a blade of grass braided into something small and resilient and beautiful. It was the quiet of a place that was, against all odds, becoming a home. Justice, he realized, wasn't something you found in a town or on a piece of paper. It was something you built, right where you stood. It was a line drawn in the dust, a warm meal, a shared silence. It was the simple, profound act of deciding that one person's life was worth defending. What lines, I wonder, have you drawn in your own life? What quiet spaces have you defended against the noise of the world? We all have them, the small patches of ground where we decide to make a stand. Sometimes we stand for ourselves, but if we're lucky, just once in our lives, we get the chance to stand for someone else. And that, in the end, is how we earn the silence that truly matters, the one we call peace.